Hi everyone, welcome to the March 2nd edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my usual co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's stakes racing, primarily focusing on Oaklawn Park and Gulfstream, where they ran a couple of Derby preps. At Oaklawn Park, the feature was the Grade 3 Southwest on Saturday. We saw last year's 2-year-old champion, Essential Quality, make a triumphant return to the races there, keeping his undefeated record intact. We also saw some top older horses in action, both on the male and female side, with last year's top older fillier mare, Monomoy Girl, making her 6-year-old debut. And over at Gulfstream in the South, we saw another Derby prep, an impressive victory by Greatest Honor, who's really establishing himself as one of the top 3-year-olds on the East Coast and one of the leading candidates for the Kentucky Derby. We'll talk about that race as well as all of the other stakes racing that took place at Gulfstream Park last Saturday. There were many stakes races, both on the dirt and the turf, in a whole host of divisions, so we'll get into that quite a bit, including a couple of interesting allowance winners on that Gulfstream card, and also last week at Gulfstream, some 3-year-olds that could make an impact later in the year. We'll finish up the show by moving on to a couple of other venues. Aqueduct, where we saw a couple of notable speed figures and races going that one-turn mile, both in a stakes and an allowance race. And then finally, we'll talk about one race from Southern California at Santa Anita, the Pasadena Stakes, which was won by an undefeated horse on the turf. But Craig, it feels, at least for me, like 2021 is really kicking into high gear now, with some of these Derby preps starting to clear up the 3-year-old picture, and some of the top older horses really getting back into action, running some pretty notable speed figures and kind of establishing themselves as some of the leaders in those divisions.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting weekend. We got a really top performance from the 2-year-old champion in his 3-year-old debut, and we got a big figure from an older horse, not necessarily from the race I would have guessed it would have come from, but it was a really big number there. Some good sprints all around, so we're just a really good, well-rounded week of racing at some high levels.
Yeah, I agree. Some really interesting racing to talk about. And we're going to kick things off at Oaklawn Park, where they ran that Southwest last week, the Derby prep offering 50 qualifying points to the winner. All of these Oaklawn Stakes races we're going to talk about were run over a wet track. While they didn't have the winter temperatures that we saw the last couple of weeks, they did have plenty of rain in the Arkansas area this past week, so it did create some sloppy conditions. But that didn't seem to bother the Southwest winner, Essential Quality, at all, and really nothing seems to faze this horse. He handles any kind of pace scenario. He's got a very versatile running style. He puts himself right in the race, but we saw in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, he can also come from farther back. But he was just better than this field, and it did help a little bit that his main rival, Jackie's Warrior, didn't really seem to handle the going and just didn't show up with his top effort. But I don't think anybody was beating Essential Quality on this day.
No, he was really good. He got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which puts him right up there with a couple of the top horses we've seen out in California. So he's right there. Jackie's Warrior was disappointing, and I think it just goes to show, many argued, and I think I was one of them, that he may have ran just as well as the winner in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but it's also possible, as we said, that he just didn't take a step forward. It could be a few things. Maybe he just matured early and it was just better than his competition early on and they've caught up, or maybe he's just not really a 2-turn horse. So I think we'll see, but he was a disappointing one, but nothing but praise for Essential Quality. He showed that he is the real deal and a top horse. And I also want to give props to Spielberg. He's a horse who kind of gets mentioned, not all that highly regarded at times, but he's a horse who just keeps running and shows up and occasionally throws in some pretty good races, and I think this was one as well. I don't think he's near the level of Essential Quality, but he certainly ran a good race for me.
I do want to ask you a little bit about the track last week at Oaklawn. In all of these stakes races we're going to talk about, the races really were dominated by horses that made wide moves down the center of the course. I didn't notice that many horses running right down on the rail, so I don't know if I want to go so far to say that the rail wasn't the place to be. I don't know if you watched more races, some of the undercard races, to see if that was really the case, but it seemed like a relatively fair track to me because it's not like we saw surprising results. Fairly logical horses were winning.
Yeah, I do think there is something that the rail maybe wasn't the best place to be. I mean, you could see the rider on Essential Quality who almost intentionally just steered his horse to get right off of it and move to the outside. The one horse we'll talk about later that I saw really struggle inside was maybe Amy's Challenge, but she may have had some other issues as well in that race. So I don't think it's cut and dried that the rail was just a death trap or anything, but I do think maybe it was just a little bit not the place to be. I would prefer if I was betting horses that they were two, three, even four wide, because those paths seem just fine, which is not what you see on your typical dirt track. We saw a lot of moves by horses 3 and 4 wide that normally don't work, and they work just fine here.
Yeah, and if you watch Jackie's Warriors trip, it's not like he was right down on the rail. Joel Rosario kept in about the 2 or 3 path for the entirety of this Southwest. I just tend to agree with you. The horse didn't really show up here, and I think it's possible that he might just want to go shorter, or it's perhaps even more possible that he was just a very precocious horse as a 2-year-old, and sometimes these don't go on. I mean, all of those who really know horses' physical makeup would talk about how much more developed he was last year than some of the other 2-year-olds. He was just built like a tank back in last summer, and it seems like he hasn't really taken a step forward since then, and maybe others have caught up. We'll see if turning back in distances does the trick for him in the future, but as for the winner, Essential Quality, I think at this point, you really do have to consider him the leader of this 3-year-old division based on what he did last year on this return race. Few have run faster than him, and I think he's only going to go up from here, so we'll see if the others can move up to get on his level.
Yeah, I would agree. He's done nothing wrong. He has good tactical speed when he needs to. So nothing but just top marks for him from me.
Another race that took place on Saturday at Oaklawn Park was actually the fastest race of this past weekend, at least from a speed figure standpoint, and that was the Grade 3 Razorback, won by the returning Mystic Guide, who was making his 4-year-old debut here, also for Godolphin. Craig, you know that I've been a big fan of this horse from day one, and he's just continued to improve with each and every start, and he's one of these classic horses that showed potential as a 3-year-old, seemed like he was really hitting his best stride at the end of 2020, and now that he's reached full maturity as a 4-year-old, he's just taken his game to another level.
Yeah, I thought he ran great. I mean, obviously, he won by 6 lengths against a pretty solid field. Admittedly, it was a Grade 3, and I would say everyone outside of him is probably a Grade 3 horse, but he did it like you'd expect. Surprisingly, he went off 2-1 for me, coming out of that good second in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, I believe it was, against a horse who went off favored in Owendale, who just seems to find ways to not win. I mean, Owendale is what he is. He's a horse without a lot of speed. He's probably just a solid Grade 3 type horse, and he always runs his race, but he ran into a better foe here, and one I am really excited about because he got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure, and that's something we haven't seen much of the last 6 or 8 months from the older horses, and he's got every right to go on from here.
Yeah, this really impressed me. I mean, he did get the right kind of trip over the track, staying in the center of the course the entire way. But the way that he finished this race, putting away some good horses like Silver Prospector and Owendale, and just leveling off so impressively, especially in that last 16th of a mile, running it in just over 6 seconds over a track where we really didn't see horses coming home very fast throughout these couple of days of the weekend at Oaklawn Park. I was really impressed by him. I'm interested to see what Godolphin decides to do with him now, because obviously being owned by them, I'm sure there's a strong temptation to bring him to Dubai to run in the Dubai World Cup. And I think it's interesting that the very next day they quickly made the announcement that Maxfield was not going to the Dubai World Cup, their other top horse. He was going to go out to the Santina Handicap. So I wonder if that means that they're strongly considering Mystic Guide for that. I think we'll find out pretty soon. But I'd love to see what he can do against Grade 1 company, because it seems like he has turned into that kind of horse.
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit I'm not familiar with the horses that have been running in Dubai, but of the horses we've seen here, he's been as good as anyone. So I think he'd run just fine in Dubai and probably be the favorite.
Moving on to Sunday at Oaklawn Park, they ran a race, the Bayakoa, prep for the Apple Blossom, which will take place later in the season. And we saw one of the top filly, or I shouldn't say one of, the top filly or mare in action in the country, Monomoy Girl, who was making her 6-year-old debut here. I mean, there's just not a whole lot left to say about this horse. It's so great that she's back in competition as a 6-year-old because we rarely see horses, male or female, competing this late into their careers. And she just always shows up, and it seems like she's still firing her best efforts at this age.
Yeah, how can she not be one of everyone's favorite horses? I mean, she just keeps running. She had that long layoff, which she came back from some issues she had, and just always runs her race. She got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. She's obviously run much faster, but I think she did what she had to do. She was chasing a couple good fillies who had things pretty much their own way up front, and she was still able to run them down wide. She's a mare who I do want to mention as far as the speed figure goes. Oaklawn, despite the wet track, was really consistent on Saturday and most of Sunday. But for the last 2 races of the day, it got much slower. So don't be fooled by that final time. When I looked through the charts, I was a little bit leery. But when I looked at the 10th race compared to the 9th and the figures, I think it's a pretty solid estimate of what she run. But there definitely was a swing in the track speed before those last 2 races on Sunday.
Yeah, she just put forth a really nice effort. She can fool you sometimes when you're watching her run because it briefly looked like she might be struggling coming around the far turn. Florent had to ask her a little bit to get on terms with the leaders, but she's just so reliable. She always kicks it in the stretch, and once she got into the straightaway, she quickly put those 2 fillies to her inside away. She's just so admirable. She always shows up. People like me can criticize her sometimes for never running a really standout speed figure, and in the grand scheme of things, some of the fastest fillies or mares that we've seen over the past few decades, she's not among them. Those are just the facts. But few horses have attained the level of consistency over the long period of time that she's raced, and that's something that's really commendable. So it's just great to see her still in action. And based on what's out there in the filly or mare division right now, nobody else is really on her level, so I expect her to continue winning. Couple of other races for the 3-year-olds that took place last weekend at Oaklawn. I'm sorry, before we get to the 3-year-olds, another race for the older fillies or mares, going a little bit out of order here. Also on Saturday was the Spring Fever, going 6 furlongs for the filly and mare sprinters, and we saw the return of Kamari for Wesley Ward, a filly who really runs on any surface, but she is undefeated on the dirt, and she kept that undefeated record intact in the Spring Fever with a very impressive win, finishing quickly off a slow pace.
Yeah, I for one wish they'd keep her on dirt because I think it's her best surface. As you said, she's undefeated, but it's not just that, it's how she wins. She didn't have much pace to run into here, and it didn't seem to matter. She was able to just swoop by good horses like Casual and Amy's Challenge. I did mention Amy's Challenge earlier. I do think she's a horse. She broke pretty sluggishly, was pinned down inside a couple other horses on that rail that was a little bit suspect to me, so I'd give her a bit of a pass for this one, but that's it. I don't think she was beating Kamari, even if she ran her best race. She got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which matches what she had run on turf last time at Kentucky Downs. But to me, she just handles the dirt really well. And granted, a couple of her wins have come over sloppy surfaces, including the last 2. But she did win her debut on a fast track by 15 lengths with a huge number as well. So I hope they keep her on dirt because she's really tough to beat right now.
I suppose you could argue her best performances on turf have come over in Europe because her speed figures on the turf in the U.S., or at least her performances, have not been quite as stellar as what they are in those races over at Royal Ascot that she has contested the past couple of years. But I'm with you. She's always looked great on dirt, and she handles fast tracks as she did in her career debut. She handles sloppy tracks as she has the last couple seasons at Oaklawn. So I'd be really interested to see what she could do, even against a horse like Gamine. She hasn't achieved that level in terms of the speed figures yet, but if they kept her on dirt for a consistent campaign on one surface, I'd be interested if she could take that step forward. So she's another exciting horse. Now moving on to the 3-year-old filly sprinters in the Dixie Belle, which they ran on Sunday at Oaklawn Park. We saw another undefeated filly in Windmill, who we talked about her with regard to her debut a few weeks ago for Larry Jones. She was a bit of a price that day, and she won from the inside, going gate to wire. Stalked the pace here, but still got up for the victory over what I thought was a pretty solid field for this level.
Yeah, Windmill looked really good. It was kind of that interesting handicapper's puzzle where you had a horse who had won two races really easily in Abrogate for Steve Asmussen, and you had Windmill who had only won her one race but had the fast figures where Abrogate didn't. And in this case, the figures won out. She backed up that 105. She got first time out with a 110 here. Did it with pressure. She was part of a 3-horse battle for the lead, and I just think she was a really good filly. She lived up to what we saw in her maiden win, and she looks to be a really top sprinter to me at this 3-year-old filly level.
Yeah, I agree with that. There were other horses with ability in this race, and she handled them pretty nicely for just her second career start. We'll see if they keep her sprinting or if they try to stretch her out. She does have some stamina breeding on the bottom side of her pedigree, but given how fast she is, and given that there are some really nice races in this division leading up to that 8 bells on Derby Day, you'd have to think that they'd keep her sprinting for the time being. Moving on to Gulfstream Park, where there are many stakes races to discuss, but the feature and the one that attracted the most attention was obviously the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth, that Kentucky Derby prep, the prep for the local Florida Derby as well. And this was won by the heavy favorite Greatest Honor, who just keeps getting it done, keeps moving forward for Shug McGahee. He's now won 3 in a row, including those 2 preps at Gulfstream Park. Didn't run the fastest race in the world, but I think you can probably attribute that to the trip that he got and the fact that he was just in a little bit of traffic on the far turn, didn't really get rolling until Jose Ortiz finally got him to the outside of the top of the stretch, and he just mowed those horses down once he got into the clear.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of this race at this point. It wasn't particularly fast, as you note. He only got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure, which was a drop of 3 points from what he had run in the last time out. I think it was in the Holy Bull. And, I mean, watching the race visually, I had written him off on the turn because it looked like he was losing ground. And looking at the chart of the race, it looks like the chart caller agreed. He went from 6 lengths back to 8.5 lengths back. And then the next thing I know, I just caught this flash on the outside. For me, it's kind of hard to say how much of it was the other horses stopping, as I think drained the clock. The runner-up ran just fine, but I really question his distance ability. I mean, he's never going to get a better chance to win at 2 turns than he had here, where, as we talked about on the forecast, he was the one horse who could take advantage of that 1/16 distance with his early speed, and he still wasn't able to hold off Greatest Honor or even come close. But for me, it's still a bit of an enigma. I do think it could be an issue for Greatest Honor that it kind of takes him so long to really get into gear. When he faces some better horses, he could find that gap that he has to make up just too much. So at this point, I'm a little bit skeptical of him, while admitting, I mean, he's an exciting horse. Everybody likes a big closer who makes that kind of late run, but he's one I'm leery of as a bettor.
Yeah, my take on this race was that, and we'll talk about it with regard to the last couple of dirt races on this card when we get to the Devona Dale in a little bit, was that it seemed like the kickback was really messing with some horses that were trying to make up ground, especially towards the end of this day at Gulfstream. And I tweeted after the race about not being thrilled with Jose Ortiz's ride on Greatest Honor, and I didn't mean that as an attack on Jose. I just, based on the race we had just seen in the Devona Dale, it seemed like you wanted to keep a horse outside of the kickback, and Greatest Honor had that position moving down the backstretch, and it seemed like Jose made the choice to try to save ground into the turn, which I thought was a little questionable, given that it seemed inevitable that some horses were going to back up in his face, because there were some horses racing up towards the lead that didn't really have a chance, and you knew they were going to come back to you. And Greatest Honor just seemed to struggle a little bit as those horses backed up, and he got the kickback in his face around the 3/8 pole, and Papatoo, who was racing in the clear, just zoomed by him on the outside. And once Greatest Honor did alter course and steer to the outside, he ran right by Papatoo and all the rest in the stretch. They weren't coming home that fast, so it's not like Greatest Honor was sprinting through the stretch. I think his late run was a bit of an optical illusion because some others were stopping to his inside, but I'm still willing to give this horse the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to go overboard and say that he's quite on the level of Essential Quality, who's proved himself against better competition and done so with the faster speed figures, but I do think the Greatest Honor is better than the figure that he got in this race. And when he gets into a race with real pace, going a longer distance, because remember, he's only gone 1.16 as of yet with this short stretch run at Gulfstream Park, I think we'll see a better performance from him. But you are going to take a short price in the future on a horse that does have a lot of people on his bandwagon at this point.
Right, and you do bring up a good point. They do use an alternate finish line for that distance at Gulfstream to kind of mitigate the short run into the turn, make it a little bit longer. But obviously, the trade-off is the stretch is shorter, so it certainly doesn't favor him. I agree with you. I think he's better than the speed figure he got here today. I just am a little bit leery of how long it takes him to get going. So we'll see. And of course, it always comes down to how these horses get bet. I haven't seen where he's going to go next. I would assume the Florida Derby. No reason to take him out of Gulfstream Park, but it's tough to say. He could go to New York for the Wood. I haven't heard yet, but he's going to be dangerous wherever he is. But he's going to need some pace too, I think, as the horses get better.
And I do want to mention just for a sec, or give you an opportunity to talk about the speed figure and how I believe that this was the only 2-turn race on the card, and you had to handle this one separately from the 1 mile races. I know that there was some confusion about the Beyer figure for this race, because I know Beyer had all the 1 mile races being much faster than this race, probably grouping them all together. Was there any difficult decision for you about handling this race a little differently?
No, this one fit pretty well. I mean, although it was the only 2-turn race, there we do have adjustments we look at and try to compare. Like there's usually a standard difference between the 1 and 2-turn races. And for me, this one fit pretty good. But, I'm never as confident when it's a one-figure race, basically based on the 1-2-turn race. So that is something that we need to, that you have to discuss. I can't remember if I put the O in there for being the only one or not. I usually do that when the figure is kind of iffy, but this one looked pretty solid to me. I don't have a big issue with it. I should mention Drain the Clock actually got a higher figure because he set a pretty quick pace up front. He got a 1:15, but this is where handicappers need to use their judgment. For me, he was on a clear lead. He had no real reason to get beat by Greatest Honor. I think he'd be very capable of running a 1:15 again, but I would much prefer him see him try it at a 1-turn mile or at 7 furlongs, where I think he could run even better than that. I'd be suspect if they went on with him on the Derby trail and tried even longer distances.
Moving on from a Derby prep to an Oaks prep, where they ran the Grade 2 Devon and Dale on Saturday at Gulfstream. This one also offering points towards the Kentucky Oaks. And pretty big upset in this race, really from across the board. All the top positions, as the 2 favorites, Vequist and Milfoy, were just nowhere to be found, as 52-1 Hole Bodemeister just completely dominated this race on the front end and ran away from this field in the stretch. Nobody else behind her did much running at all.
Yeah, this was an ugly race. When you see something like that, the horse won by 6.5 lengths. I mean, nothing surprises me too much with 3-year-olds. So a big win off a horse, even as a bomb, isn't going to just make my eyes pop out of my head or anything. But the surprising thing for me is it wasn't a fast race at all. She only got a 1:01 TimeformUS speed figure, which basically means nobody else did any running at all. So I guess that contributes to a 52-1 shot winning easily. I do want to mention Gulfstream was just a disaster for timing the mile races on Saturday. But I did time all of them from video, including fractions. I'm very confident in the times that I used. The Gulfstream mile races are really easy to time because the gate never moves. The run-up's always the same, give or take maybe a foot or two, if that. So timing from the gate is really simple to do. It's really easy for me to time the fractions. So even though there were no times pop up on the screens for a lot of these races, one of them where they did, the Fearless race, the times were off, in my opinion, by a substantial amount. So I don't use those times, particularly for races of this kind of importance. I do my best to time everything, final time and fractions.
That's really good information, and I saw your tweet about that, the differences between all the times, and most of them are slight, but you mentioned the one that was a significant difference, and obviously that's reflected in the speed figures, so that's good for people to know who might be a little bit confused about how the speed figures correspond to the posted official times for these races. I agree with you. It was kind of weird to watch this race. Only one horse did any running, and you typically would expect a race like this to produce a fast speed figure. It didn't. Everybody else who finished behind Hole Bodemeister just didn't really seem to run their race, except for the 2 other long shots that filled out the superfecta, Competitive Speed at 53-1, who was third, and Penn Street, who was fourth at 84-1. Just a really bizarre race. I talked about the Fountain of Youth with regard to the kickback and how some horses that were racing in behind seemed to really react badly to it. That's all that I can come up with for some of the favorites in this race who didn't show up. Vequist, who was between horses in a little bit of traffic, not detrimental traffic, just racing behind horses in the early going. She was empty by the time they got to the 3/8 pole and backed up. And Milfoy, I would at least give her a bit more of an excuse because she did have a long shot, Adios Trippy, just back up in her face at about the 3/8 pole, and John Velasquez was just kind of caught in the wrong place at the wrong time and had to steady her back. And once you lose momentum on the far turn at Gulfstream on the dirt, it's really difficult to regain it. So maybe that was her excuse, but she really did no running after that. So I don't know what to make of the horses that finished towards the back of this race. Maybe this is one of those ones you just want to draw a line through, but a really difficult race to use form going forward out of.
Yeah, I'd be leery of a horse like Vequist. One thing I've learned over the years is when 2-year-old fillies don't come back very good, people tend to still bet them, and they tend. I'm not saying she can't turn it around, but as a guy who bets the races, it's something I'd be willing to take a shot against.
Now, as I said at the top, there were a lot of stakes races at Gulfstream Park on Saturday. We're going to try to talk about most of them, but we'll try to speed through a little bit. We're working backwards. Towards the middle of the day, we saw the Grade 2 Gulfstream Park Mile, one of many races going a mile on this card on the dirt at Gulfstream. And this one resulted in a minor upset as Fearless got the job done off a long layoff for Todd Pletcher, beating the heavy favorite Performer, who just was a little bit dull.
Yeah, my only two real takes from this race are Fearless got most of his speed back, or at least some of it. He had been dropping off the map on the Trackers or GPS chicklets that we see in his last few, but something happened in that layoff that he got some of that speed back. So good for him. He got a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. I don't think that's going to strike fear in any of the top older males out there, but it was a good step forward in his return. And at this point, I think I'm willing to give up on Performer. He's just not that good for me. I could use the excuse that he was chasing the runoff leader, Wind of Change. That's a place I never really like a horse to be, but he just had nothing for me. He couldn't hold off Avant Garde, so he just looks like a Grade 3 horse to me who I don't know where that big race he ran at Gulfstream came, or at Aqueduct came from, where he beat Tax, but that seems more like the outlier.
Yeah, I'm with you on Performer. You know I wanted to give him one more shot in this race, and he was pretty disappointing for me. I mean, he was the first horse chasing that runoff leader, Wind of Change, but he never seemed like he was traveling that eagerly. Horses ranged up outside of him. He had very little response, didn't respond like a horse that was in the bridle at any point. So this was not a good effort, and let's be honest, he's a horse that's had a couple of very long layoffs in his career. He's missed a lot of time, so there could be physical issues there. Maybe he's just not as good as he once was, so I'm a little down on him coming out of this race. And as for Fearless, I mean, he's bred to go longer. He's handled longer distances in the past, so I'd imagine Todd Pletcher's going to stretch him back out to 2 turns, and perhaps you can be optimistic about him moving forward off this race. I'm with you. I didn't think it was the toughest field in the world once Performer didn't show up, but I do think Fearless might have better in him. Moving on to the turf, we saw the Grade 3 Honey Fox towards the end of the day at Gulfstream Park, and the likable older mare Got Stormy held on here in a blanket finish. Desperate nose victory for this mare who has been known to sort of give it up at the end of her races over the past couple seasons, and that's kind of what she did here. It looked like she had it sewn up coming to the 16th pole, and it got very close at the very end of the race as a couple closers came at her at the end. Even though she won this race, I'm a little leery of Got Stormy moving forward.
Yeah, I am as well. She ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, which is about what she was running when she was winning those sprints, and ran pretty well in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint last year. So I think at this point that kind of defines what she is. She's more a Grade 3 type mare, which is no knock on her at 6. I mean, she's still bringing in the checks, but it's going to get tough if they keep her at a mile. If they take her back to sprinting, usually face a little lesser competition, and she'll probably rack up a couple more wins. But if they try to move her back into Grade 2 or Grade 1 company even, I think she's really going to have a tough time with that. I know we were probably actually both rooting against her, as both our picks from the forecast were the ones making moves, but she did still show she's pretty determined. She was pretty gritty to hang on at the end over Zofel.
Well, you're picking this race. Feel Glorious probably ran the best race because this was a race where the pace mostly held together. I mean, God Stormy and Jakarta were right there at the end, and anytime Jakarta's around at the end of a two-turn race, you know they're not really coming to get the leaders. And Feel Glorious, who somehow was a crazy price at 11-1. She almost got there making a run from the back of the pack, so she ran really well. But yeah, I'm with you on God Stormy. She just seems to hit a wall at the end of these two-turn races, so I'd be a little skeptical of her if they move her back up in class next time. Staying on the turf with the fillies and mares and stretching out in distance towards the end of the day at Gulfstream, we saw the Grade 3 the very one stakes, which was won by the Belmont filly Antoinette. Craig, you know, I'm not this horse's biggest fan, but she does seem to take advantage of these types of spots, and she always shows up, and she got it done once again.
Yeah, I mean, she's got some quality. She's a 4-year-old now, and she ran her career best speed figure here, 116. But I'll be the first to admit she did it with the just a very easy trip. She set a moderate pace at best. The pace figures got increasingly faster as towards the end of the race. So, you know, I'm not going to get overly excited about her. I mean, all you got to do is look at the chart. It was kind of a merry-go-round with the horses who were 1, 2, 3 at the beginning, 1, 2, 3 in that order at the end. Bellara, who we mentioned at the end of the forecast, kind of got the trip we predicted, where she was just going to save ground all the way and be a factor at the end. But it was just too easy for Antoinette. Nobody really challenged her. She had plenty left turning for home, and nobody was really coming from the back. So looking at the horses coming out of this race, I'd almost be willing to give a horse like Tuned a shot against, if it was the very same field, if there were some pace to challenge Antoinette, because I thought Tuned ran fine. Antoinette ran fine, but just nothing for me to get overly excited about.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about this race on the forecast last week, and I was a little skeptical of Antoinette perhaps offering bad value in this race. That wasn't the case. They let her go off as high as 7-2, and that was probably the right price on her, given the class advantage that she had over this field. And as you said, with the way the race was run and the fact that it was just kind of a merry-go-round race towards the front, they were never catching her. So she'll face tougher competition in the future. I'm sure that Chad Brown has some better horses in his barn than he ran in this race, but when she faces this kind of competition with no pace, she's always going to be tough. Moving on to the males on the turf, we saw a couple races going both short and long. The longer one, going a mile and 3/8, was the Grade 2 Mac Diarmida, which is run on the front end by Phantom Currency, who was stretching back out to one of these longer distances. And I was a little worried at the beginning of this race as he ran off a little bit under Paco Lopez, but he quickly got him in hand, set a moderate pace, and nobody could get him in the stretch. It looked like there were a couple Mike Maker horses that might be dangerous at the quarter pole, but Phantom Currency just turned them away.
Yeah, to turn away a couple Mike Maker horses at distance is no small feat. Just the one thing I noticed about Phantom Currency that I almost never see is he ran the exact same pace and speed figure at every single pointed call, a 120. So obviously that was his overall TimeformUS speed figure. I guess you could say the top two, they ran 1-2 all the way around. So maybe the race favored those up front, and given that moderate pace, not really a surprise there. So just a good solid ride from Paco Lopez, who, as you mentioned, he kind of got him under control because it looked like he might take off on him, but good horse, a 120. Maybe he could move up a little bit. Well, this was a Grade 2, so that's probably about right for this race. You know, he's just a 5-year-old gelding, so maybe he's got a little more in the tank.
Yeah, this race got a respectable speed figure of 120, but I think some of the older marathoners that we've seen in these last two races in this division at Gulfstream Park, both the WL McKnight, which was won by Tide of the Sea, and both this Mac Diarmida, which was won by Phantom Currency, these just don't seem like the top older turf horses are going marathon distances out there, and if they are, well, then that's a pretty weak division this year. We'll see. I would imagine that Chad Brown must have some better horses back in his barn somewhere. He didn't even have a starter in this race. So we'll see who comes out in this division in the future, but I wasn't thrilled by these horses. Phantom Currency, I thought, got the trip and got it done, but he'll face tougher tests in the future. Staying on the turf and cutting back in distance to the Grade 3 Canadian, going the mile and a 16th on the turf, we saw Venezuelan Hug come through under an amazing ride by Junior Alvarado, who looked like he made room where I didn't think there was room to get through between horses in the stretch, and this horse just kind of burst through out of nowhere to get up to win by a nose.
Yeah, this was a race that the TimeformUS pace projector had predicted would be a fast pace. The figures didn't really bear that out, but sometimes I think there's a little more to it than just the figures, because it was a pretty compact up front, and I think there were probably some duels going on in there. Sometimes you can't really see it with the naked eye as horses jockey for position, but whatever the case was, a couple horses came from the back, and as you say, I think the ride Junior Alvarado gave clearly made the difference in this race. He was able to get through and beat Olympic Runner, who, if he had any trouble at all, if he'd had just the slightest break, he wouldn't have gotten up here.
Yeah, just to see how evenly matched this field is, the 1st through 7th finishers got TimeformUS speed figures that are all within 2 points of each other. So just a blanket finish in a race that was really determined by trips.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a grade 3. Those top horses all got 116, so no great shakes there. I mean, it is what it is. At this time of year in Gulfstream, we're not going to get the best turf horses running just yet. I think we're going to see better as we move to Keeneland and eventually to Belmont.
Kind of a wacky race to watch from a pace standpoint was the Palm Beach for the 3-year-old turf horses a little earlier on the card, as Annex got the victory from well back, but he was so far back in the early going because there was a runoff early leader, Arzak, who opened up a significant margin on the runner-up, on the second flight horse down the backstretch, who was in turn far ahead of the rest of the field, just going a crazy pace on the lead, and no surprise, they came back to the field, and Annex was able to make the final run to get up.
Yeah, he was actually, according to the chart, 22 lengths behind at one point. But as you said, about half of that was just the leader. So sometimes those running lines can be a little deceiving. Obviously, all the fractions are in red. I think the pace figures for the leader were approaching the 170 mark at one point. So obviously much too quick. I remember when I was uploading the figures, I kind of saw the pace figures in this huge mess of data, thinking that can't be right. And then I looked at the chart and went, oh yeah, that was that race. So I knew what was going on there. Solid effort. Clearly a race that fell apart. I think the top 3 or 4 are probably pretty evenly matched, and it just came down to trips. Annex got a 106, Scarlet Sky a 106. So solid efforts, but they'll have to do a little better. I did want to mention, if you look all the way down to the bottom of the chart and see that runoff leader, you will see where in TimeformUS, though we reward horses for going fast early, when they run off like that, we don't. This horse did get a little bit of bonus because of the pace, but nowhere near what the pace figure would indicate. If, for example, the horse was battling with another horse and they were a half length apart.
Yeah, and I like this horse, Annex. I had been impressed by his debut. I actually did mention him on that Horses to Watch segment I do, just because I thought he overcame a little bit of greenness to win that day. I mean, I wasn't the only one who saw that because he was bet down to 6-5 in this Palm Beach, but I like the way he's progressing for Belmont. He's very lightly raced. Seems like he's figuring things out slowly but surely. So a 106 is okay for 3-year-olds at this time of year. So I think this horse has a bit of a future ahead of him. And so might Arzak if they finally turn him back to turf sprinting, because he showed really impressive speed here. I just the wrong kind of speed for the distance he was going.
Right. Now, you mentioned Bill Mott. I just want to throw in, he is having a really good meet at Gulfstream. Something I don't remember him having for several years. So whatever he's doing, I don't know if he pointed for these races, but his whole stable is just running really well.
Sometimes with these trainers, it seems like the luck is all concentrated in one period of time in one place, and he's winning a lot at Gulfstream. If you look at his stats at Aqueduct, he's like 1 for 31 because he has a pretty large string of horses there. I think he won a second race this past weekend with a 3-year-old debut horse, but it's kind of funny how you can have all your success at one venue. That's just the way it seems to work out sometimes, but he's definitely firing his best shot at Gulfstream at the moment. Wrapping up the Gulfstream action from last week with a few allowance races to talk about. We saw a race for the older horses early in the day on Saturday, won by Nocturnal, a lightly raced 4-year-old for Todd Pletcher. This was just the 3rd start of his career, but he's really done nothing wrong. I mean, he was beaten in his debut by Dr. Post, and now he's won 2 in a row.
Yeah, not only has he won two in a row, he took a nice step forward here. He had run a 106 speed figure last time when having things pretty much his own way in blue fractions up front, but he got a 114 here. So, and he also was able to sit off a leader. Pace was pretty solid. So, promising horse. Don't have a lot to add about him. He needed to get a little quicker as a 4-year-old, but as you said, it was only his third start. So it's certainly within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, and he's got a nice pedigree. His dam's a half-sister to that multiple Grade 1 winner, Carolina, who I think won the Ogden Phipps, and I think another Grade 1 as a 3-year-old a few years ago for Todd Pletcher. So if they can keep him on the track, he's going to be a nice horse. He made his debut in his 3-year-old season and obviously was off for a long time now, being a 4-year-old, coming back off another long layoff. But he seems like a horse that does have some ability.
Yeah, and I want to mention, he was one of those horses like we talked about at Oaklawn who came in maybe looking a little light on the speed figures compared to some others. But I do want to point out, sometimes those horses do win. The horse was 3 to 5 for a reason, and sometimes they are able to run faster, and this was one of them.
Another horse that was visually impressive on Saturday at Gulfstream was Collaborate, who won a one-turn mile maiden race by over 12 lengths in his second career start. This was a horse who had been well-meant in his debut in the slop, was a little green, off slowly that day, came with a bit of a late run, but he was much more professional in this second start.
Yeah, he looked great. Unfortunately, I was a little surprised to see how slow the race came back. And I use the word slow in air quotes because it's all relative. But watching the race, I don't think anybody would have been surprised if this got a figure that was as good or better than the Fountain of Youth later on the card. But it turns out it was only a 104. I think he was just beaten up on pretty weak competition. When you look through the chart, there wasn't much coming in. He was even money for a reason. Even the horses behind him had figures that are better than they had run, or at least as good as they had been running. So I don't have any problem with the figure, and I think he probably just looked a lot better than he was due to the field. If they raced him, entered him in a horse like the Florida Derby, which I saw some people thinking that could happen, I would be way against him in that spot.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point. I just don't think there was much of quality behind him, and that had everything to do with the margin of victory here. I did like the way that he did it. He had very easy early speed, albeit through moderate fractions, and I liked the way he was kind of pricking his ears back and forth at the quarter pole, just kind of waiting for Tyler Gaffalione to ask him to run. He seems like a horse that might have more in the tank, but he's going to have to show he can do it against better competition in the future. Finishing things up at Gulfstream, staying with the 3-year-olds that might be on the Derby trail. We saw one of those on Friday in a 1 1/8 allowance race, which was won by Known Agenda. The beaten favorite in the Sam F. Davis taking a slight step back in class to contest this N1X race, going the 2 turns. He certainly looked good in victory, but I think his performance was a little bit overshadowed by some of the shenanigans that took place on the racetrack and after the race.
Yeah, I've seen the video of Irad punching a guy sitting in a chair. Not sure what I think of that. Could at least ask him to get up first, is my opinion. But not sure what happened there. Was he mad that he claimed foul? I'm guessing that's what it was, because it looked like Irad kind of came in and cut him off to me, though admittedly the head-on view of the incident is pretty poor, and it's hard to be decisive about what happened. But as far as the horse goes, it was nice to see him rebound. I know after the Tampa Derby, you had surmised that maybe he just didn't handle that Tampa track, which is something that seems to happen for horses who aren't used to it. And it sure looked to be the case here, because he got a 108 TimeformUS speed figure, which was even better than his figure from, I think it was the Remsen back at Aqueduct in December, and obviously much better than his Sam Davis race. So I mean, a 108's nothing for me to get too excited about, but I would assume they're going to give him another shot on the Derby trail coming up, whether it be Florida or New York, maybe even Keeneland. But it's decent enough showing, but he's got some work to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about Known Agenda. He's a good horse. We saw that as a 2-year-old when he ran that maiden race beating Greatest Honor. Maybe he took a slight step backwards in a couple stakes after that. I thought he had some excuses, both in the Remsen being on a dead rail and not really handling the kickback in that Tampa Bay race. I like that he showed better tactical speed here, and obviously he wants every bit of distance that he can get, as he ran away from this field easily going the 1 1/8 distance, which can be demanding for 3-year-olds in February. But as for what happened during and after the race, I mean, personally, I mean, the altercation that these two riders had after the race, that's whatever. I mean, they should penalize them for that. But I'd personally be more upset about what IRAD did during the race. And I know some people have trouble watching what happens on the turn of races and being sure who crossed whose path. I know that can be difficult. One tip that I would have if you're confused about that is to watch the tire tracks on the racetrack and watch where the horses are running in relation to those tire tracks. And typically those are pretty consistent as they come around the turn, and that's kind of a trick that you can use to see when horses cross paths on the turn. And if you watch the horses coming past the quarter pole in this race, you can see that IRAD pretty deliberately asked this horse to come over about 2 paths into Paco's horse. Now, I'm sure Paco maybe instigated it by trying to drift a little on the turn. That's what he does. But the way that IRAD tried to come over on that horse, knowing that he wasn't totally clear, because you could see him looking around and basically trying to force Paco's horse to clip heels, that's not good. And it would be bad enough if he did it one time, but we see IRAD do this all the time. I mean, he did it in a maiden race last year at Belmont with that horse Blackjack Davy for Linda Rice. I can think off the top of my head, but he does it in a bunch of races, especially on the turf when he tries to bull his way out at the top of the stretch, and it's not good. And they penalized him for the fight afterwards. I think they should have penalized him for what he did during the race. And I mean, I hate to say it, but eventually something bad's going to happen when you allow this to go as the stewards. And I just don't think that kind of behavior should be rewarded or should be let go. And when I was making my Eclipse Award determinations at the end of last year, and it was basically a tie for me between Irad Ortiz and Joel Rosario, I can't lie about it. One of the factors that played in my mind was that Joel's a top rider, and he doesn't do that. He doesn't try to make other riders clip heels or try to bull his way out. He gets himself in trouble quite a bit, but he doesn't ride the way that IRAD does. And I think the stewards really need to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. It was a topic I didn't know how much we wanted to get into, but all you had to do was look to Sunday, where Arad had just another, to me, egregious ride where he does what he does. He moves to the rail, he saves ground, he gets to the stretch, and he just makes a hard right, and he doesn't seem to give a crap who's in the way. And he almost caused the horse to go down. And even more egregious than Irad's riding is that the stewards didn't even look at it. There wasn't an inquiry posted. For some unknown reason, Tyler Gaffleone didn't file an objection. So I don't know what's going on there, but as a guy who bets horses, I'm personally sick of it.
And I know some people will say to me, oh, well, you're aligned with the NYRA racetrack, so you can only say this about Gulfstream Park. Well, that's how horse racing works. I mean, obviously, I'm more at liberty maybe to say something about a Gulfstream race than a NYRA race, but I mean, all the stewards do this. The NYRA stewards let it go. Every steward lets this kind of stuff go on. And I think while we don't have a national governing body in horse racing, at some point people have to put their heads together and say, well, this is a problem everywhere in this country, and we have to start laying down some rules and assigning some fines that are commensurate with what these riders actually earn, because it doesn't really make sense to assign somebody who's making millions of dollars a year with his mounts $1,000 fine and give that same fine to somebody who's far less successful. The fine should be actually deterrent from that rider doing it. So that's just my 2 cents on the situation.
Yeah, and for me, it's giving Irad a competitive advantage when he knows he can just take his 4-5 favorite and sit on the rail and bull his way out with no consequence. He's on the best horse already, and then he's just ensured getting the best trip. And it seems like the other riders be damned, he's coming out. And yeah, at some point, I hope something's done about it, because eventually something bad's going to happen. And that's the last thing I want to say as a guy that loves horse racing.
Finishing up things on this show with a couple noteworthy performances at Aqueduct before we get to one race out in Southern California. The venerable, likable, admirable Mr. Buff got another victory against listed company in the winter at Aqueduct in the Stymie. I feel like you can just change the name of the race to whatever it is, the Jazzle, the Alex Emra, whatever the race is. I mean, Mr. Buff just always seems to show up in these winter races at Aqueduct, and he put forth his typical winning performance here, although they didn't make it easy on him because Musical Heart really tried to go after him in the early going, but Mr. Buff just had a little too much heart down the lane.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting flow when you look at the speed figures. You can see that although he was on the lead, he was going fast. And then as they went from the half mile to the 6 furlongs, the race really picked up from a 126 pace figure to a 133, which doesn't sound like it's only 7 points. But if you do the math, it means they probably ran that third quarter in a 140 plus pace figure. If we did incremental figures, you'd be able to see that, but we don't. But you can kind of figure it out just looking at it. The race really picked up. He was able to fend them off and then hold off Limonite, who's a decent horse in his own right. So just, I thought a really good effort from Mr. Buff. Limonite ran just fine, though he did get a good trip in there. And Musical Heart really is in top form. He's just unfortunate that he has to keep running into Mr. Buff in these spots.
Yeah, I do have to say, I mean, this is getting a little in the weeds, but I was a little surprised to see the first two calls have lower pace figures than I was expecting, because 22 and 4 and 45 and 2 was extremely fast over this Aqueduct course. I know there was one other mile race on the day that we have as almost an unbelievably slow pace, so that just surprised me a little bit. And the pace line for Limonite's a little surprising to me, because I didn't see the race picking up at the point that the pace figures have it picking up. I thought they were going extremely fast down the backstretch. But regardless of that, I mean, Mr. Buff ran a really nice race to win, and Limonite got the trip, and maybe he's not quite on the level that Mr. Buff is, and the margin was only half a length, but I still thought that Mr. Buff was pretty game to hold on, because these are just the races that he's supposed to win, and when he's supposed to win, he generally does win.
Yeah, for sure. And I will mention when we do the pace figures for these, because it's one-turn miles, I am looking at all of the one-turn races, not just the miles. They're weighted a little bit differently. You don't want to get into those weeds on here, because I could spend a half hour on it. But it's not just the other mile race that would make those figures go down.
That's good info, and good for me to know, because I was wondering about that. One more race to talk about from Aqueduct on Sunday, going that same distance, the one-turn mile, though featuring a much slower pace, which probably helped the winner Zoomer a little bit, but pace advantage or not, this horse really ran a nice race to win. I don't know exactly where it came from, because he's an older horse that had never really done this before, but this was a very impressive race, first off the claim for Rob Atras.
Yeah, Rob Atras found what he'd done. I mean, don't get me wrong, he'd run some fast races before. Two back, he'd run a 116 on the lead, but this was a fast race for sure. He got a 119 here, but the final time figure was a 125. I think I saw you tweet that the buyer speed figure was a 104, so we're pretty much right in line there, maybe just a point off. But it should be noted, as you say, he was kind of gifted a lead, clear early lead in slow time, and that's when these horses are going to run super fast figures. So I have no problem with us knocking this performance down a little bit to that 119 speed figure, and I think it's probably a pretty accurate representation of what kind of horse he is.
Yeah, we're on the same page about that. It was very impressive. The final time number was extremely fast for this level and for this horse, but the pace had a lot to do with it, and the fact that he got no early pressure from his main rival Tenderfoot, who was maybe not ridden as aggressively as you might have hoped when he was reserved on the inside behind this horse. So I should also note that Rob Atras only had him for the one race, because he was claimed back by Bob Clissaris, who had him previously out of this race. So we'll see if he can hold the form that he's displayed in this race. Finishing things up on this podcast with that one race from Southern California from last weekend. It was the Pasadena going a mile for the 3-year-olds on the turf, and a race that I saw some people on social media were impressed by, as Rock Your World got the job done here, keeping his record intact, 2 for 2 in his career. His debut came sprinting, stretched out for the first time here. I watched this race after I saw some of the social media chatter about it, and I have to say I wasn't quite as impressed as I expected to be, though this horse obviously did what he needed to do.
Yeah, I'll keep it short on my comments here. He got a 105 first time out. He got a 102 here. I didn't make the figure, and I admittedly haven't seen the race. It is a little bit of a funky looking running line where he loses a position in some ground pretty late in the race and then comes back. So I'll leave it to you to say if he had some traffic trouble, because I just haven't had a chance to view it yet.
Yeah, no traffic. Just looked like he came off the bridle a little early on the turn. Like he almost lost a bit of focus coming to the quarter pole. And it looked like he was briefly going to be in danger to Cathkin Peak, the other even money favorite in here. They both were even money, who was on the inside. But looked like Cathkin Peak wanted to lug in the stretch and had some trouble getting off the rail. And Rock Your World decided to spurt away at that point when Cathkin Peak was being a little bit difficult for his rider. So he ran fine. I just didn't think that there was a whole lot behind him. There wasn't a big distance from first to last in this race. So for me, he's going to have to do a little bit better in the future. And I think the jury's still out whether he wants to go short or long.
Yeah, the horse I was actually most interested in seeing run in here was Red Flag, and I do want to go back and watch it, but he's a horse I hope they'll get back to the dirt. I'm willing to draw a line through that Low South Futurity just because horses they often run goofy races. They're either good or bad, so I'd like to see if that Del Mar Futurity, or the Bob Hope, not the Del Mar Futurity, where he won so easily, was a fluke, or if it was in a race where maybe I need to revisit the figure, or if he's truly just a better dirt horse.
Yeah, that's a good point about him, because it did seem like he had a bit of an excuse in the Los Alamitos Futurity after that, but hasn't gotten a start on dirt since then, so we'll see if he can get back to that big performance from last year. Well, that's all the racing from this past week. Thanks for sticking with us. It was a big show. We're lots to talk about both at Oaklawn and Gulfstream Park. But we'll have some interesting races to handicap upcoming on the TimeformUS forecast this Friday. There's a trio of Derby preps taking place around the country, including races at Santa Anita, where Life is Good, one of the top 3-year-olds out west, is supposed to run, the Gotham in the east. So plenty to look forward to handicap later this week. Remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to tune in to that TimeformUS forecast on Friday.